In this mini-lecture we will discuss forests, their value, current and historic deforestation problems, various forestry management strategies, the role fires play in forests, and various types of protected areas. After reading Chapter 12 and watching this video, you should be able to summarize the ecological and economical contributions of forests, outline the history and current scale of deforestation, assess aspects of forest management and describe methods of harvesting timber, recognize types of parks and protected areas and evaluate issues involved in their design. You're probably familiar with forests. I'd venture to guess you've been in one. I'm hoping you have at least. But did you know there are a variety of types of forests, with each type being categorized and defined by dominant tree species? For example, the eastern U.S. has forest types that are significantly different from the western U.S. In the east you'll find forests like spruce fir, oak hickory and longleaf/pine. In the west you'll find forests such as Douglas fir, hemlock spruce, and pinyon juniper. The forest biomes found in the U.S. include temperate deciduous forest, on the east coast, temperate rainforest, on the west coast, boreal, in Alaska, and tropical rainforest, in U.S. territory Puerto Rico. My personal favorite forest type is the ponderosa pine forest. If you ever get a chance, go smell a ponderosa pine, they smell like vanilla. I fell in love with this forest because of the time I spent at Phil Mount Scout Ranch in Cimarron, New Mexico, both as a scout and as a backcountry staff member. Do you know the difference between a forest and a wooded area? Forests are defined as any ecosystem with a high density of trees. Wooded areas are ecosystems with a low density of trees. Forests cover 31% of the Earth's surface. The most widespread forests are the boreal forests of the northern latitudes and the tropical forests near the equator. Forests provide priceless ecosystem services. To name a few, forests regulate moisture and precipitation patterns, prevent erosion and flooding, recharge aquifers, purify water, return organic material to the soil as leaf litter. Forests also enhance our quality of life by influencing culture, providing aesthetic beauty, enhancing health, and providing recreation and adventure opportunities. Additionally, forests store carbon, which is of great international interest because if carbon can be stored in forests, this can help to reduce the effects and extent of climate change. Consequently, cutting down forests worsens climate change. Forests also provide us with valuable economic resources as well. Industrial harvesting has allowed us to extract more timber than ever before. Some of the forest types used for timber extraction include boreal forests, rainforests, and southern pine plantations in western coniferous forests in the U.S. Commercial products we can derive from forests include medicines, such as the cancer medication we discussed earlier this semester, fuel, paper products, food, and lumber for building ships, homes, and other buildings. Our demand for the material goods we create from forest products and our need for land to grow food to feed our growing population causes us to clear forested areas. This has led to deforestation, or the removal of trees from at a rate that exceeds forest regeneration. Deforestation causes declines in biodiversity, soil degradation, desertification, and contributes to global climate change due to the release of stored carbon and the loss of a carbon storage sink. Sadly, deforestation is what propelled the expansion and growth of the U.S. and Canada during the 19th century. During this time much of North America's native and primary forests were cleared for the development of farmland and construction of cities. By the 20th century, most of the primary forests, which are forests with no clear visible indicators of human activity, were destroyed, as this image illustrates. According to the UN Forest Resource Assessment in 2005, there was 1 billion acres of forest in the U.S. prior to the European settlement. Researchers at the University of Michigan estimate that since 1600, 90% of primary forests in the continental U.S. have been cleared. The primary forests that do remain are referred to as old-growth trees. Trees that sprout after old-growth timber was cut are called second-growth trees, which form secondary forests. The inherent problem with the logging industry is that unless a sustainable forestry management system is put in place, loggers will lose their jobs when the region is depleted of marketable trees. The logging companies will then move on to a new region. Now that the ancient trees of North America have been harvested, many logging companies have transferred their operations to developing countries. Since the majority of North America forests were cleared in the 19th century, deforestation in North America has slowed largely because there are relatively few primary forests to harvest anymore. Unfortunately, that doesn't mean deforestation has stopped. Now we see that rapid deforestation is occurring in developing countries. This is especially true in Indonesia, West Africa, Central America and Brazil. Specifically, tropical rainforests in Southeast Asia and Indonesia are being cleared for palm oil plantations. Palm oil is used in snack foods, soaps, cosmetics, and as a biofuel. Clearing forests acts as a positive feedback loop because if some forest is cleared, this encourages further development and even more forest to be destroyed. As roads and other infrastructure are built for the palm oil plantation, this increases illegal logging because there are now roads in areas that previously did not have a well-established and easy-to-travel transit route. One thing I want you to consider is the trade-off that is being made between growing a crop for biofuel and preserving natural forest. Don't despair though. Uncut tropical forests still remain in many developing countries, such as Brazil, Indonesia, and West Africa. These countries are desperate though for economic development and in foreign capital, which means that there are few logging restrictions in these countries than other well-developed countries. Loggers who want to harvest resources from developing countries often pay a concession, which is a fee paid by a foreign corporation to a government for the right to extract resources. While the country receives some revenue from concessions, the economic benefits of deforestation are short-term. Furthermore, there is little incentive for the foreign corporation to manage the forest sustainably or to hire local workers. The jobs that are created are temporary, only lasting as long as the resource. The wood is usually exported to North America and Europe, so all in all, the party that profits and benefits from this agreement is the foreign corporation and the developing country is left with a wasted landscape. One effort that has been used to stem the tide of deforestation in developing countries is for conservation organizations to buying concessions to preserve, not cut, forests. These concessions are called conservation concessions and they essentially pay the developing country to not harvest and exploit their natural resources. One project that helps reduce deforestation in developing countries is the Palm Oil, Timber, and Carbon Offsets Project, or POTICO. The World Resources Institute, or WRI, runs this project. The WRI works with palm oil plantation companies to steer them to land that is already developed and to help them make their plantations sustainable. This allows the WRI to either protect the forest that would be developed or allow Forest Stewardship Council, also known as FSC, certified sustainable forestry on the land. Another program aimed at helping to mitigate the effects of deforestation is the Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation, or RED, project. This is a program developed at a recent international climate conference that asks wealthy nations to pay poor nations to conserve their forests. In exchange, the wealthy nations receive carbon credits to offset their emissions. Through this program, Norway is paying Guyana up to $250 million to preserve the forests of Guyana. We will now move on to forest management. Forestry quite simply is the practice of forest management. As has been mentioned before, forests are semi-renewable, meaning they can replenish themselves if they are not exploited too quickly. Foresters are professional managers who must balance demand for forest products, which are short-term benefits, with the importance of forests as ecosystems, which are long-term benefits. Resource managers are professionals who use strategies to manage and regulate potentially renewable resources. These resources include timber, soil, fresh water, rangeland, wildlife, and fisheries. Sustainable management, by definition, does not deplete resources. There are three general forestry management strategies we will consider: maximum sustainable yield, ecosystem-based management, and adaptive management. Maximum sustainable yield aims to achieve the maximum amount of resource extraction without depleting the resource from one harvest to the next. This strategy can be utilized for other natural resources as well. A population grows fastest at an intermediate size. The downside to this though is that the population is at half its carrying capacity. Maximum sustainable yield manages and harvests the resource so as to always keep the population at half of the carrying capacity. This allows for there to always be a maximum yield in the harvest. The downside though is when this strategy is used to manage forests, the ecology of the area is altered and certain habitats within the forest never develop. Due to the problems associated with maximum sustainable yield management strategy, more and more research managers are beginning to use the ecosystem-based management approach. The ecosystem-based management approach seeks to minimize impacts on ecosystems and ecological processes by considering the entire ecosystem, not just the main resource of interest. An ecosystem-based management approach for forestry might include provisions to protect certain forested areas, restore ecologically important habitats, consider patterns at the landscape level, and preserve the forest functional integrity. The problem with ecosystem-based management is that it's challenging to implement. Ecosystems are complex and our understanding of how they operate is limited. Another problem is that there are different interpretations and approaches to this strategy. Adaptive management is a system that tests different approaches and aims to improve methods over time. With adaptive management, resource managers monitor results, adjust methods as needed. Adaptive management is very much like a scientific experiment in long-term resource management because hypotheses about best management strategies are continually being tested and results are used to refine the management plan. This method is complicated and can be time-consuming, but it does work very well for resource management. There are several approaches to harvesting timber. One method is the clear-cutting system. In this system all the trees in an area are cut down at once. This method is utilized because it is inexpensive, however. This method has significant ecological effects such as complete removal of an entire ecological system, erosion, changes in the climax community following succession, and changes in the microclimate. A microclimate is the zone in which the climate or temperature is different from the larger surrounding area. For example, the area under a tree that is shaded has a different microclimate than the ground that is not shaded. Another harvesting approach is the seed tree or shelter wood system. In this system a small number of large trees is left in a clear-cut area to help reseed the area or provide shelter for growing seedlings. The final method we will consider is the selection system. When this system is used, a small proportion of the trees in the stand are harvested, leaving behind the majority of the trees in the forest. This is an uneven age stand management system, which means that the stand of trees is always of mix of ages. It's important to note that all of these methods significantly modify structure and function of natural ecosystems, however the latter two are less environmentally damaging than clear-cutting. Forest management has evolved over time. For example, the U.S. Forest Service suppressed forest fires for nearly a century because they did not realize how important fires are to a forest ecosystem. Thanks to forestry science and research, we now know that many ecosystems depend on fires for seed germination, grassland preservation, animal diversity and abundance. Natural forest fires also removes excess vegetation that can act as kindling for future fires. The consequence of a policy of fire suppression is that we have experienced catastrophic forest fires that are much worse than they would have been if nature had been allowed to run its course. These catastrophic fires damaged property, harmed forests, threatened people and their homes. The graph here in this slide shows that catastrophic fires now occur more often and are more severe than they were in the 1980s. After a string of severe forest fires in California in 2003, the U.S. Congress passed a law to encourage removal of small trees, underbrush, and dead trees following the fires. It's ironic that the act that started this was called the Hell Forest Restoration Act, because we now know that removing these materials is actually harmful to the health of the forest. What this act called for is called salvage logging, which is the removal of dead standing trees, also known as snags, following a natural disturbance, e.g. fire, windstorm, insects, disease. While this seems logical, it is actually really destructive. Snags provide food, nesting and roosting cavities for animals. Additionally, removing timber from recently burned areas increases erosion and soil damage, impedes forest regeneration, and promotes future fires. Now let's consider parks and protected areas. Federal, state, local and international parks allow us to preserve functional ecosystems by designating certain areas as protected land. Globally, 12% of all land is under some sort of protection. People establish parks and reserves to protect and preserve vast or unique scenic areas, provide outdoor recreational opportunities and adventures, generate revenue from ecotourism, offer peace of mind, health, exploration, wonder, and other non-market values, protect ecosystem services, and to preserve biodiversity. The National Park Service of the U.S. was started in 1916 to manage both parks and monuments. Today there are 401 sites managed by the National Park Service, which include National Historic Sites, National Recreation Areas, National Wild and Scenic Rivers, and other areas. National parks are just one type of federally protected area in the U.S. Another type of protected area is the National Wildlife Refuge. The National Wildlife Refuge system began in 1903 under President Theodore Roosevelt. Today there are over 560 sites covering 151 million acres. The refuge system is administered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The activities that are allowed on refuges include hunting, fishing, birding, wildlife observation, photography, and education. One wildlife refuge that occasionally comes up on Capitol Hill is the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. This is the largest refuge in the system and home to some very sensitive ecosystems and species. It becomes a hot topic about every 10 years or so when it is proposed to explore drilling for oil and gas in this area. This area is also feeling the effects of climate change, as the areas near the poles are very sensitive to the effects of climate change. National wilderness areas are another type of federally protected land. Activities on these lands are even more restricted than some other types of federally protected areas. Specifically, the following things are prohibited in wilderness areas: roads and structures, timber harvesting in commercial enterprises, bicycles and other wheeled vehicles, mechanical transport, motorized vehicles and equipment, aircraft landings, removal of plants, stone, or moss for personal or commercial use, and removal of historical or archaeological artifacts. Human activities have significantly altered the landscape. Specifically, agriculture, residential developments, roads, logging, and other activities divide natural habitats into small, disconnected fragments. These fragments are sometimes called islands of habitat. This is a problem because some species, like bears and mountain lions, need large, continuous habitats. Sadly, these animals are starting to disappear because they are unable to survive in habitats that have been reduced in size due to human activities. Another problem is that these small fragments may be too small and isolated to be recolonized by local species. Habitat fragmentation also creates what are known as edge effects. Edge effects are when environmental conditions, such as wind exposure, temperature, light, etc., change along a fragment's edge. Think of it this way: the interior of the forest has different environmental conditions than the edge of the forest. But if the forest is fragment, what once was an interior region of the forest, now becomes an edge. Edge effects go beyond abiotic conditions. For example, Parasites and predators easily attack bird nests on edges and interior bird species may not be able to reproduce when forced near the edge of a fragment. Fragmentation is the main reason for decline of populations of North American songbirds. When designing ecological preserves, conservation biologists have argued about whether it's better to create one large reserve or many small reserves. This is called the Sloss dilemma. Scientists studying experimental forest fragments in the Amazon. They compared a variety of ecological measures between small, medium and large fragments of forest. They found that species were less likely to survive in smaller fragments and species were lost faster in smaller fragments. Fragments that were far away from other continuous stretches of forest lost more species. Species adapted to the interior were threatened by even small gaps and openings in their fragment. Some birds were unable to navigate gaps between fragments that were as small as 100 and 260 feet wide, and bees, beetles and some animals that reside in trees were unable to move from one fragment to another if the gap was even as small as 50 to 330 feet. One interesting discovery that was made through the Amazon's Sloss dilemma research was the idea of a corridor. Corridors are areas of natural, undisturbed, and protected land that allows animals, insects and other organisms to travel between islands of habitat. What we've learned is that in order for these to be affected, reserves are most effective at preserving species if corridors connect them. A former student of mine has an insightful way of explaining this. Roads connect humans to each other, but they disconnect and separate wildlife from each other and their habitats. Corridors act as a way for wildlife to move safely through a landscape. The picture on the left shows what most corridors look like in the U.S. in many other countries. The picture on the left is an innovative example of a wildlife corridor over a freeway in the Netherlands. This is an inspiring example of what we can aspire to. That concludes this mini lecture on forests, forestry management and protected areas. Please review the weekly outline and complete the activities for this week per the schedule set forth in the outline.